back to AP Macroeconomics. I'm so glad you decided to join us this evening. My name is Jen Rayfield, and I'm coming to you from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, where I work at Ridge High School. And tonight we're going to be continuing our review of Unit 1 in preparation for the AP Macroeconomics exam. Okay, so what we're going to be reviewing tonight is the law of demand, which, as you know, describes the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded of that service. So there's a demand curve for us. We're also going to be reviewing the law of supply, which describes the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied of a good. There's a nice upward sloping supply curve. But where we're going to spend most of our time tonight is talking about markets, right? Markets exist as a result when buyers and sellers come together. So you need demand and supply in order to make a market. And virtually all of the analysis that we do is in a market with supply and demand. So this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. So we want to be able to define market equilibrium. We also want to define surplus and shortage. We want to be able to explain why markets achieve equilibrium, why when the price is such that the quantity demanded is not equal to the quantity supplied, market forces will correct that imbalance or that disequilibrium and restore the market to equilibrium. We want to be able to calculate the surplus or a shortage in a market that has an imbalance in it. And we want to be able to explain how changes in demand and supply affect market outcomes. So when I say market outcomes, I mean the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity, the quantity bought or the quantity sold. We are going to be focusing tonight on scale 4C. And this is the scale that asks us to be able to demonstrate using a graph the effect of a change in an economic situation. So even though you're not going to be submitting answers on the AP Macro exam this year that include graphs, you will definitely be better able to answer the questions that you have to answer if you feel comfortable and confident using graphs in order to describe, predict, and explain what's happening, right? Okay, so let's do a warm-up, and this is going to be a little bit different from the way we've been approaching warm-ups. I'm going to ask you a question that's sort of a review-based kind of a question. So I want you to think about what you've learned in this course so far, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to see if you can name each of the supply and demand models in AP Macroeconomics. So go ahead and take 30 seconds and think about the graphs that you've learned and which of those are supply and demand graphs. Hopefully you've got at least a couple. All right, take about 10 seconds to finish writing your answers. All right, let's see how you did. Okay, so in Unit 1, this is the unit that we're reviewing, we're taking a look at predominantly product markets, right? This is a supply and demand model for a good or service. Now, some of what you learned in Unit 1 probably included some resource markets where you were maybe graphing oil, which is an input or an input in production. You were modeling the price, the supply of and demand for oil in an economy. You might have been modeling the supply and demand for wheat or corn or some other commodity that's widely used as an input in goods and services. So whether it was a product market or a resource market, in Unit 1, you were learning basic supply and demand. In Unit 3, when we started studying national income and price determination, you started using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is a supply and demand model for the entire economy. When you got to Unit 4, you learned about the money market, which has the supply and demand for money in a nation. And you also learned about the loanable funds market, which is the supply and demand for borrowed money in a nation. And then last week, we reviewed Unit 6, which included foreign exchange markets, which is the supply and demand for currency. So even though Unit 6 isn't going to be on the exam this year, And even though you're more than likely going to be dealing with macroeconomic supply and demand models on the AP macro exam this year, it's really important that you understand how foundational basic supply and demand concepts are to your ability to use these other tools that are going to be the basis of your analysis in AP macroeconomics. All right, so what do you need to do? So I did like a control F in the course and exam description for the word model, and it occurs 284 times. Now, not all of those are in the context of the learning objectives in terms of content or skills, but the majority of them are. And so models are the tools that economists use to describe, predict, and explain economic behavior and to interpret economic phenomenon. And all of the topics and concepts that we're going to talk about and review tonight are applicable to all the supply and demand models in the course. So for example, the skills that you need to be able to predict the effect of a change in demand on the market price and quantity are the same skills you need to predict the effect of a change in aggregate demand on the equilibrium price level in real GDP. So these skills are completely transferable. And so what I hope to show you tonight is that these tools are incredibly helpful in answering any kind of question about macroeconomics. All right, so the enduring understanding for this part of the unit is that in a competitive market, demand for and supply of a good or service determine the equilibrium price. So let's start with the law of demand, which says there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, which produces the downward sloping demand curve. Well, what's an inverse relationship? Basically, what that means is that the two variables in question, right? When you're creating a model, you're plotting one variable in terms of another. An inverse relationship exists when they go in opposite directions. So as you know, the law of demand asserts that when price rises, quantity demanded falls, and when price falls, quantity demanded rises. So that's all an inverse relationship is. It's also sometimes called a negative relationship because it has a negative slope. All right, why is there an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded? Now, I'm going to give you the three reasons for the downward sloping demand curve, but what I want you to know is that you're unlikely to be asked a question about the three reasons for the downward sloping demand curve for a single good, but these are analogs for the several of these are analogs for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, which is in the course and exam description. So if you understand fundamentally what these are, it will help you understand the reasons for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve in Unit 3. All right, so the first, it's called the income effect. And basically what that means is if we're looking at we're going to be talking about good X. So when the price of good X rises, the purchasing power of a given income goes down. And consumers have relatively less income, so they buy less of good X. So when the price falls, right, the purchasing power of a given income rises, people feel relatively richer, and so they buy more of good X. That's the income effect. The substitution effect operates on for most goods in a very similar way. When the price of good X rises, good Y becomes relatively cheaper than good X. And so consumers substitute towards good Y and buy less of good X. And the reverse is true as well. When the price of good X falls, good Y becomes relatively more expensive compared to good X. And so consumers are going to substitute towards good X and away from good Y. So those are the two reasons that have analogs in the aggregate demand, the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. The last one is called the law of diminishing marginal utility. If you're simultaneously studying AP Macroeconomics this year or any microeconomics, this is probably really familiar to you. Basically what it means is each additional unit of a good that you buy and consume is less satisfying to you than the previous unit of a good consumed. And so in order to be willing to buy the next unit, it's going to have a lower price. So these two you really want to understand because of the way that they can help you understand the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. All right. So then another thing you want to understand is that factors that influence consumer demand, such as changes in income, cause the market demand curve to shift. So I am sure you remember talking with your learning in your class about the shifters of demand. They're also called the non-price determinants of demand. And that's a term you might want to use because if you use non-price determinants of demand as the way to describe those forces that change the amount of a good people are willing to buy at every price, then you'll understand that a change in price is not a shifter of the demand curve. All right, so you've learned these. There's a lot of different ways to organize them. You probably learned an acronym. I actually stay away from the acronyms because you don't have to memorize what these are. You have to understand them so that you can recognize when you're reading a problem whether or not the factor that's changing is going to influence the buyers in the market or the sellers in the market. So if there's a change in tastes and preferences, that's going to change consumers' willingness to buy a good at any price. The number of consumers in the market is also a shifter of the demand curve. So for example, the age at which you can rent a car in the United States is 25. You must be 25 years of age in order to rent a car. Now imagine that all of a sudden the rental car companies decrease the age and make it 18. Well, what's going to happen to the number of people who seek to purchase a rental car? It's going to increase. So if there's an increase in the number of consumers in the market, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. Expectations play a big part in people's economic decision makings. And on the consumer side, expectations of future prices and expectations of future income are the ones you probably want to be most familiar with. And this makes perfect sense. If you know that the price of something is likely to fall in the future, what's going to happen to your demand for it today? Aren't you going to buy less today and buy more in the future when the price is lower? So your expectation of what's going to happen is going to affect your buying today. Same thing with income. As I'm sure you know right now, a lot of people's incomes have fallen, and many people expect that our economic circumstances are not going to be good for quite some time. And so people are going to start saving their money because they're worried about how long they're going to have a given amount of money for. So expectations of future, if you expect your income to rise, you're probably going to spend more today, buy more goods and services. If you expect your income to fall, you're probably going to start buying less. Okay, so your current income is an important determinant of demand as well. And so when we looked at the income effect, we looked at the change in purchasing power of a given income because of a change in the price of a good. Now we're talking about an actual change in consumer incomes. And so this should be really intuitive. Most of my students find the shifters of demand, the non-price determinants of demand, really intuitive because we're buyers, right? So we understand the forces that affect our own behavior. So if you have more money, if your income goes up, you're going to increase your consumption. Demand for goods and services is going to shift to the right. At the price of related goods, this is a fun one. Kids really love thinking about related goods. So we have two types. We have complementary goods, which go together in consumption. And you want to think the classic example is hot dogs and hot dog buns. Most people buy them together. And then substitute goods are opposite in consumption. Most people buy one or the other. So hot dogs and hamburgers, right? Of course, some people buy hot dogs and hamburgers together, but for most of us, when we're deciding what to buy for dinner, we're choosing one or the other. All right, so these are the non-price determinants of demand. And what we now have to do is make sure we can recognize the difference between those things that are going to change demand and those things that are going to result in a change in quantity demanded. So let's go to the next slide for that. Right, this is probably one of the trickiest things in all of economics, the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. It has applications in every supply and demand model that you're going to look at for the entire course. So we have two identical downward sloping demand curves here. This is the market for a good. We have the price on the vertical axis. We have the quantity on the horizontal axis. We have that downward sloping demand curve showing the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So right now, the price is $2 and we read from the vertical axis to the demand curve to find that the quantity demanded at a price of $2 is 10. All right, so now let's apply a change. The price is going to fall from $2 to $1. What happens in this market? Well, we read across to the demand curve and we find now that at a price of $1, the quantity demanded is 20. We call this a movement along a given demand curve. This is a change in quantity demanded. It is due to a change in price. Now let's go to the other model. If we increase demand, which we show by shifting the demand curve to the right, we can see that what this means is at the price of $2, there's an increase in the number of units people are willing to buy. So what I want you to notice is that in both models, we went from 10 units to 20 units, right? So this increase in the number of units that are being purchased by consumers is identical. But two very different things happened. So we have to use different terms. We have to understand that when we have a change in the number of units people are buying because of the price, it's a change in quantity demanded. And when you have a change in the number of units people are buying because their willingness to buy at any price has changed, it's a change in demand. Okay, so this here is a change in quantity demanded. This here is a change in demand. A change in quantity demanded is a movement along a given demand curve and is only caused by a change in price. And since this is review, you know that the only thing that's going to cause a change in price, a movement along a demand curve, is a change in supply, right? So a change in supply causes a change in quantity demanded. A change in demand causes a change in quantity supplied. So just knowing those terms is really helpful. Okay, so you should write this down. A change in demand shifts the demand curve and is caused by a change in a non-price determinant of demand. Again, you're never going to be asked, here's a change, which of the non-price determinants of demand is it? You're never going to be asked that kind of a question. What you'll be asked is to figure out, okay, something changes. Is it going to change demand or is it going to change quantity demanded? So you have to know, is this something that affects buyers or is it something that affects sellers? A change in demand is a change in quantity demanded at every price. Okay, so now let's transition to supply. So the law of supply tells us that there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied, which produces the upward sloping supply curve. So what's a positive relationship? Well, it means the two variables that you're examining a relationship between are moving in the same direction. When price rises, quantity supplied rises, and when price falls, quantity supplied falls. So that is a positive or a direct relationship. The two variables move in the same direction. Why is there a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied? In some ways, it's a lot simpler than the demand curve. And basically, if you're in micro, you've learned a lot about the supply curve and marginal costs but if you're just studying macro, all you really need to know is that basically the more units you produce, the more expensive each unit is to produce. Basically, as because cost increases as output increases, which leads producers to require a higher price in order to be incentivized to produce the next unit of a good. The best and most intuitive example of this that I ever came across was in an MR University video. If you've never checked out that website, there's some great lessons there. But basically, they're talking about the market for oil. And as I'm sure you all know, oil, like some oil is really easy to get at. In some places, it's very close to the surface. The weather and the climate are very temperate. It's easy to transport drilling equipment in and out of the location. And so when you put an oil well there, those units of oil are very easy to get to. They're very inexpensive. Now you look at a place like Siberia, right, where the climate is very harsh, where there's not a lot of infrastructure to get drilling equipment in, where the oil is really, really deep in the ground. If you want to increase the production of oil and you go from an oil deposit in Texas to an oil deposit in Siberia, right, those units of oil in Siberia are going to be a lot more costly to produce. And so the incentive for producers to produce those units is a higher price. So as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases, right? Because producers require a higher price to produce those more costly units. All right, so we also want to take a look at what are the non-price determinants of supply. So basically, anything that causes a change in profitability is going to shift the supply curve. So if it makes it cheaper and easier to produce, if profitability increases, supply is going to increase. If it makes it harder or more costly to produce, then it becomes less profitable and supply is going to decrease. So what are the things that influence profitability? Well, the most important one is the cost of production. So you'll remember that inputs in production, the factors of production, are land, labor, and capital. And so when the prices of inputs rise, it becomes more costly to produce goods and services. So the profitability decreases and supply decreases. So when input costs rise, supply decreases. A change in wages is a really important determinant of supply, and you want to distinguish it from a change in incomes. When incomes go up, you're being asked about the effect on consumers. When wages go up, which of course leads to higher incomes, but when wages go up, wages are from the perspective of the producer. So when wages increase, we want to read that as a shifter of the supply curve. Change in incomes, shifter of demand, change in wages, shifter of supply. In the United States, wages constitute like 70% of input costs. So a change in wages has major implications for supply. A technological advance, in general, technological advances need to be understood as something that makes it cheaper to produce and is going to lead to an increase in supply. Government intervention in a market in the form of taxes and subsidies will also affect profitability. And basically, if the government levies a tax on a good or a tax on producers, it effectively increases the cost of production, makes profits go down, makes supply go down. A subsidy effectively makes it less costly to produce. Governments can also regulate businesses. And so additional regulations in general effectively make it more costly to produce, whereas deregulation effectively makes it less costly to produce. So expectations are important input in firm decision making. So expectations of future prices and expectations of future market conditions are also going to affect producers' willingness to supply at every price. If you're a producer and you think you're going to get a higher price for something in a couple months, you're going to cut back on the amount you're bringing to market today. There'll be a decrease in supply today. Okay, if you expect the economy to get it better in the future and people to be buying more in the future, and you expect prices to be higher as a result, then you're going to cut back on the amount you're selling right now. And the reverse is true as well. Okay, and then finally, the number of producers in the market. If there's an increase in the number of producers, supply shifts to the right, supply increases. And if there's a decrease, it shifts to the left. That should be pretty intuitive as well. All right, so those are the non-price determinants of supply. So again, you don't have to memorize them. You just have to think. If there's a tax on the production of a good or service, is that going to affect consumers or producers first? And the answer is producers. So that's the work that you want to be able to do. All right, we also want to make sure that we know the difference between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. So we've got two supply curves. We've got a price of $1 and a quantity supplied of 10 units. All right, if the price rises to $2, we're going to have a movement up and to the right along a supply curve to a new point. And now we can see that when the price rises from $1 to $2, the quantity supplied is going to increase from 10 to 20. Now, what if we have an increase in supply that changes the number of units producers are willing to produce at every price, including at a price of $1. So now with this new supply curve, our quantity supplied is 20. So you can see again, we have an increase from 10 units to 20 units and an increase from 10 units to 20 units, but for very different reasons. This is an increase in quantity supplied caused by an increase in the price. This is an increase in supply. So a change in quantity supplied is a movement along a given supply curve and is only caused by a change in price. And a change in supply is a shift of the supply curve and is caused by a change in a non-price determinant of supply. And remember, you want to read a change in supply as a change in the quantity supplied at every price. All right, now if you've got that down, then the next part is going to be pretty straightforward. All right, so the last topic in Unit 1 is market equilibrium. And the essential knowledge statement is that equilibrium is achieved at the price at which quantities demanded and supplied are equal. So what is equilibrium? It's the condition that exists when no market participant, no buyer or seller can be made better off by changing their behavior. No one has an incentive to change what they're currently doing. So it's also described as when market forces have come to rest. So why do market forces stop operating when the price is such that the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied? And basically because sellers can't be made better off by raising or lowering the price, and buyers can't be made better off by buying more or less of a good. So no one has any incentive to change what they're doing. And now let's look at a model to see that. I think that's the best way to illustrate equilibrium is to use the model. So I created a little grid here. We've got price, quantity. I put in some specific prices and some specific quantities so we can do some of that calculating. That's one of the learning objectives. All right, so we've got a downward sloping demand curve and we've got an upward sloping supply curve. And the question might be, what is the equilibrium price and quantity in the market? So we find the point at which supply and demand intersect, and we read across to the vertical axis to find the market price of $20, the equilibrium price of $20, and we read down to the vertical axis to find the market quantity of 20. All right, so there's our equilibrium. So we can say that the equilibrium price is $20 and the equilibrium quantity is 40 units. Pretty straightforward. All right, now what if the market is in a disequilibrium? What if the market price is not equal to the equilibrium price? So the sellers are responsible for setting prices. You don't go into a store and say, I'd like to pay $5 for that. You go into a store and you read the price tag. It's set by the seller. Well, what if the seller sets the price too high? So if the seller in this market sets the price at $30, then we can read across this price line to see that at a price of $30, consumers are only willing to buy 20 units. The quantity demanded is 20. But at a price of $30, the quantity supplied is 60. So when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, the condition that exists in the market is known as a surplus. So this is what is meant by a surplus. It's the condition that exists when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So, but this is a disequilibrium, and we'll see that market forces will lead to people to change their behavior. So what's going to happen is if sellers are producing 60 and they're only selling 20, then they're sitting there with 40 units that are going unsold. So if you're a producer, you can be made better off by selling those units. But if they're not going at a price of $30, what are you going to do? You're going to lower the price. So sellers have an incentive when a surplus exists to lower the price in order to sell those surplus units. So what is the number of surplus units? It's the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Units will only be sold when there's a buyer and a seller. So there are 40 units that have sellers, but no buyers until the price starts to fall. So suppliers will, when a surplus exists, the suppliers have an incentive to lower their price in order to sell more units of the good. So what's going to happen is as the price falls, we have a movement down along the supply curve. As the price falls, quantity supplied falls. And as the price falls, quantity demanded rises. And so the market is going to return to equilibrium. As long as that price is greater than the equilibrium price, a surplus will exist. Sellers have an incentive to lower the price, and the price will keep falling until we get a buyer for every seller, or we get a consumer to purchase every unit that is for sale. So as sellers lower the price to sell surplus units, quantity supplied falls, quantity demanded rises. You should make sure you understand this. A surplus is eliminated through falling prices. All right, now what if they go too far, right? Sellers don't necessarily know the equilibrium price. So let's say they keep lowering the price until they get to a price of $10. Well, now let's read the graph to see what happens. Well, at a price of $10, the producers are only willing to produce 20 units. So the quantity supplied is only going to be 20. At a price of $10, though, a lot more consumers want to purchase it. And so our quantity demanded is now 60. So again, we have this wedge between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Only in this case, we refer to it as a shortage because the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So when the market price is less than the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and the market has a shortage. Well, suppliers are going to recognize that people keep coming in to buy this thing that they don't have in stock. So what they're going to start to recognize is that they can be made better off by raising the price. So sellers have an incentive to raise the price in order to meet the excess demand. As the price rises, the quantity supplied is going to rise, but as the price rises, the quantity demanded is going to fall. So as sellers raise the price to meet demand, quantity supplied increases and quantity demanded decreases. A shortage is eliminated through rising prices. That's how market forces work. And once the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, once the price exists such that quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, nobody has any incentive to change their behavior. If sellers raise the price, they'll create a surplus. They'll have extra units they can't sell. If they lower the price, they're getting less money for each unit, and sellers are incentivized to charge the highest price the market will bear. Right? If the price is too low, consumers can be made better off by buying more. If the price is too high, consumers will be made better off by buying less. So when the equilibrium price When the price exists such that quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, no one has any incentive to change what they're doing. And so market forces will come to rest. All right, this is important for understanding why a change in demand or a change in supply leads to a change in the price in a market. So that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, so the changes in the determinants of supply and or of demand result in a new equilibrium price and quantity. So here's our market for automobiles. It's an equilibrium at a price of 20. I'm put it in thousands, so it's a little bit more realistic. So assume that the equilibrium price of a car is $20,000, and at that price, the number of units sold in a time period is 40,000 units. Well, if real income increases, what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity of automobiles? So the first thing you have to ask yourself is this going to affect buyers or sellers? And remember, income is a non-price determinant of demand. So as income increases, we're going to see an increased willingness to buy at every price. Demand is going to increase, which we show by shifting the demand curve to the right. Now, look at what happens. At the initial price now of $20, the quantity supplied is 40, but the quantity demanded is 60. There's an increase in the number of consumers willing to buy at $20. It creates a shortage. This shortage is eliminated by rising prices. So as sellers recognize that there's an increase in demand for their product and that they're selling faster than they expected, they start raising their price in order to be willing to produce more units, right? So as the price rises, the quantity supplied rises, but as the price rises, the quantity demanded falls. And so we end up at a new equilibrium price and quantity here where the demand and the supply curve intersect. So our new equilibrium has a higher price and a higher quantity. So I'm going to go back to this for just a second. Oops, I'm going to go back. So more often than not, we become so used to shifting the demand curve or shifting the supply curve and just finding the new equilibrium point that sometimes we forget this intermediate step, which is that initially there's a shortage because of the increased willingness to buy at the market price. That shortage is eliminated through rising prices. Okay, now let's do the same thing, but we'll look at a different shift factor. So again, we're at equilibrium, $20,000 for a car, and at that price, 40,000 cars are being purchased. If wages for automobile workers increases, what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity of automobiles? Well, again, wages, when you see wages, think supply. Wages is an input price, right? It's factor income for labor. So if wages rise, then profitability is going to fall. So supply is going to decrease. We show a decrease in supply by shifting the supply curve to the left. Now, here's a shortage is created again with the new supply curve. The quantity supplied at that price is only 20, but the quantity demanded is still 40,000. And so we have a shortage again. That shortage is going to be eliminated by rising prices. Sellers are going to raise their price, increasing the quantity supplied. As price rises, quantity demanded is going to fall, and we're going to achieve a new equilibrium price and quantity here. So the price has risen, but the quantity has fallen. So be very systematic in your approach to these kinds of questions. Are we looking at a change in something that will affect consumers or producers? If it's a change in consumption, shift the demand curve and then read your graph. If it's a change in production, then you shift the supply curve and read your graph. You don't have to intuit your way to an answer. You don't have to rule answer choices in or out. Use the tool, apply the change, and read the model to get your answer. So that's what we're going to practice now. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it with my fingers crossed, is I'm going to switch to my document camera, and we're going to do some of these questions together the way you might be doing them as you're taking the AP exam. So I took a couple of questions that illustrate the key concepts. Get that mouse out of the way. All right, hopefully that's nice and clear for you. This is a very typical kind of question. So we're told that the American Heart Association has just issued a report warning consumers about the negative health effects of eating beef. Okay, which of the following changes in the beef market is most likely to occur as a result? Well, if you are told that eating beef has negative health effects, you are likely to eat less beef, right? So we are going to see a decrease in demand for beef. right? This is going to change people's tastes and preferences for beef. So now before I even look at the answer choices, I'm just going to sketch out a quick supply and demand model. So we have price and quantity, we have a downward sloping demand curve, we have an upward sloping supply curve, we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. If we have a decrease in demand, then demand is going to shift to the left. So there's our new demand curve. And here's our new equilibrium price and our new equilibrium quantity. All right, so the price fell and the quantity fell as well. So the supply curve shift to the left. No, absolutely not. It's a shift of demand. The demand curve will shift to the left, decreasing the price. Well, yep, found it. There's our answer. We don't even have to spend time reading the rest of it because we know demand shifted to the left and we read our graph to see that the price decreased. All right, so let's try another one. Okay, a change in which of the following will cause a change in the supply of personal computers? Well, a change in supply means we are shifting the supply curve. We're either going to increase it or decrease it. So a change in demand for personal computers, well, this is the kind of thing where kids often get a little bit tripped up. We have a demand curve and a supply curve. When we shift the supply curve, we're either shifting it to the left or to the right. So a change in demand is not going to cause a change in supply. It's going to cause a change in quantity supplied. The price of disks, which are complements to personal computers. Well, when we're talking about complementary goods, we're probably talking about consumers, right? Producers don't necessarily produce computers and disks, but consumers certainly used to use computers and disks together. So that's not the answer. The price of personal computers will not change supply. It will change quantity supplied. How about technology? The technology used to produce, technology you want to read as a factor that affects supply. We're talking about the technology used to produce something. And obviously consumer incomes would be a determinant of demand. So technology, change in technology would be our correct answer. All right, so let's go on to another one. Which of the following events will cause the demand curve for hamburgers to shift to the right? Well, if we are shifting the demand for hamburgers to the right, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for an increase in demand. So which of these things is going to cause demand for hamburgers, and this is hamburgers, to increase? So if the price of French fries, goes up, what happens to the demand for hamburgers when hamburgers are complements? Well, if you eat hamburgers with your French fries and the price of fries go up, there's going to be a decrease in the quantity demanded of fries. So you're going to buy fewer hamburgers to go with them. So this is actually going to cause a decrease in the demand, which we show as a shift to the left. So that can't be the right answer. How about an increase in the price of hamburgers? Well, remember, I'm going to give us a demand curve here. A change in the price, so an increase in the price, would look like this. That would cause a movement along a given demand curve. It's not going to cause it to shift to the right. A decrease in the price of hamburgers would cause a movement down and to the right along a given demand curve, but it's not going to cause the demand curve to shift to the right. How about a decrease in the cost of producing hamburgers? That's going to shift the supply curve. And so this must be the right answer, but we can show that it's true. When the price of pizza goes up, if hamburgers are a substitute for pizza, you're going to have a decrease in the quantity demanded of pizza. And if you're going to substitute away from pizza for hamburgers, then the demand for hamburgers is going to increase, which is what we were looking for in the first place. So E is the right answer. Let's do one more. It looks like we're not going to have time tonight for all of the ones I wanted to do, but this is a great, we'll do two more. This is a great example of a question that allows you to use the model. A decrease in raw material prices will change equilibrium price and quantity in which the following ways. This couldn't be a better example of where you want to use a model. Now imagine a decrease in energy prices will change price level and real GDP in which of the following ways? It's exactly the same thing, right? In terms of skill, in terms of thinking. So we have price and quantity, we have a downward sloping demand curve, we have an upward sloping supply curve, we have an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So a decrease in the price of an input cost is going to cause profits to go up, right? If you can sell it at the same price and it costs you less to produce it, then profits are going to go up. That's going to cause supply to increase. We show, and remember, don't be fooled by doing a decrease in supply, which looks like shifting up. We want to increase the quantity supplied at every price. So we shift the supply curve to the right. So when supply shifts to the right, we're going to create a little bit of a surplus here at the initial price, and the surplus is eliminated through falling prices. So here is our new equilibrium, and we can see that the price has fallen and the quantity has risen. So price decrease is what we're looking for in our answer choice, and quantity increase is what we're looking for. And that's how you solve that problem. So this type of analysis is going to be useful to you, whether you're looking at price and quantity and a market for a good or service, or you're looking at price level and real GDP, or price and quantity of the nominal interest rate and the quantity of money in the money market, real interest rate and the quantity of money in the loanable funds market. It's the same kind of analysis. Use your tools. As my dear friend and fabulous economics teacher and colleague says to her students, you're not too cool to graph. So use your graphs. All right, so let's do this last one. I think this one is a really great, more than likely, if you're asked about supply and demand in a macro context, you're going to be asked about simultaneous changes in demand and supply. So this conceptually is a simultaneous shift question. So the graph shows the supply and demand curves for a particular brand of computers. In 2018, there were 10,000 computers sold for $1,000 each. In 2019, there were 9,000 computers sold for $1,000 each. Which of the following changes in supply and demand curves could most likely have caused this change? So to me, the easiest way to approach this is to find those 2 points and then use the model. So in 2018, we sold 10,000 units at a price of $1,000 each. And in 2019, 9,000 computers were sold, but also for $1,000. So 9,000 is less than 10,000. So we're going to put our new quantity here, but the price is $1,000. So this is the point we have to get to. Well, let's see what happens if we shift demand to the left to get that point. Okay, so demand is going to decrease. Well, that we get to that point, but that's not our equilibrium, because this is where that new demand curve hits that supply curve. So this can't be it can't only have been a decrease in demand. If we decrease supply at the same time, now we see that we can get an equilibrium at that point. So the demand curve must have shifted to the left, and the supply curve must have shifted to the left as well. So again, using the graph allows us to solve this problem. All right, so that's the last one we have time for. I hope you found this, regardless of whether you're answering a multiple choice question or an FRQ, you're going to find that using your graphs is really helpful in figuring out the answer, and also proving that your answer is true for those explained points. So now let's just finish up. So I'll go back to our PowerPoint. We did our guided practice. Okay, let's go down. Okay, so this is what we looked at tonight. We finished up Unit 1 with topics 1.4 to 1.6. We looked at demand, supply, and then markets with demand and supply curves in them. You want to know the law of demand, the law of supply. You want to be able to define those terms, surplus and shortage. Explain how a shortage or a surplus exists when their price is not the equilibrium price, so that you can describe how prices adjust to restore equilibrium, right? A surplus is eliminated through falling prices, a shortage is eliminated through rising prices. When we have a graph that's got some numbers in it, once we identify the quantity demanded and supplied at a given price, we can easily calculate the size of the surplus or the shortage. And then we finished up looking at how to use graphs to explain how changes in demand and supply affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So those were our goals for tonight. And I hope you feel more confident with these topics, and also in the knowledge of how these foundational thinking skills are going to be of such value to you as you review the rest of the supply and demand models in this course. All right, we spent a lot of time looking at that model for that reason. Okay, and again, whether it's a product market model or a resource market model or the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the money market model, the loanable funds market. If we're increasing demand, we read to find the new equilibrium. If we're increasing aggregate demand, we read to find the new equilibrium. If we're increasing the supply in the money market, we're looking for the new interest rate. And if we increase supply in the loanable funds market, we're looking for the new interest rate. It's very similar analysis. Okay, so as always, we conclude with our announcement, our call for students. If you or someone you know needs a device or internet access in order to be able to take the AP Macroeconomics exam, please, please, please reach out to the College Board at cb.org/tech. All right, everyone, thank you again so much for watching, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in a couple of days. Have a good night.